Welcome to In Focus. I'm Peter Laffin, editor of the Washington Examiner's In Focus section, where we deliver deeper coverage of the political, cultural, and ideological issues shaping America. Our guest today is Jakub Grygiel. Jakub is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, a senior advisor at the Marathon Initiative, and associate professor at the Catholic University of America, and he recently contributed an article to our section titled, "Giving Tomahawks to Ukraine is the Only Way to End the War." Jakub, welcome to In Focus.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You argue very strongly in the piece you wrote for us that the U.S. needs to supply Ukraine with Tomahawks. And we've seen some conflicting reports in the last few weeks of whether or not Trump is serious about doing this. Why do you think that's such a central piece of bringing this war to a resolution?
Well, there's nothing magic about the Tomahawk per se. So it's not that this is a magic weapon that will resolve everything. But I think it's a sign, it's a symbol of support, and in particular, it's a symbol of our willingness to escalate or to risk escalation with Russia. And therefore, that our support for Ukraine is no longer so tacit or very gradual or calculated to avoid upsetting the Russians, but it's expressly calculated to inflict pain, public pain on Russia. The fact that Putin immediately called Trump, and when the talk about these Tomahawks started last week, to me, it's a sign that Putin thought, this is dangerous. I better calm down President Trump. And so far, he seems to promised him a meeting in Budapest that obviously was canceled even before, 24 hours after, essentially, after started talking about it, because obviously the Russians were not serious about it. But it was, to me, it was a sign that actually affected, even the talk of these things affected Trump. Again, from an operational military perspective, I'm not sure this is the magical weapon that will solve. There's no such a thing. It would allow Russia, obviously Ukraine, to be much more precise and strike targets that are very hard, if not impossible, for them to strike just because of the distance. And it would impose direct costs on logistics and, including energy production of the Russians. Again, not the only thing they'll decide, but the sign that this sends, the symbol in many ways, I think is quite important in this war.
So Trump has said he needs some guarantees that, if we give you this technology, you're not going to strike, population centers, things like that. To what extent can we trust Ukraine in that sense?
I think we can, because they know that they're fully dependent on our support. So they're very careful in not upsetting us or Europeans for that matter. And so they've been fairly respectful, I think, as far as I know, on how they use the tools that we or the Europeans give them. So if we tell them not to use these things on certain targets or in Russian territories, they have not used them. And I'm sure there are also technical ways of limiting where and how they strike. So we have sort of some even, I guess, material control of where these Tomahawks or other tools that we might give them go. But I think the Ukrainians are quite aware they're not suicidal. They don't want to upset not just the president or the leaders, but actually the Western population, which I think is not 100% behind them. And so I think, it's not that we have to trust them, it's that they have an interest, and they are quite aware of the interest of not upsetting us by misusing the tools that they're given.
What about the risks of escalation? You see every now and then some Russian minister will come to the press and saber rattle. How seriously should we take those threats?
It depends. I mean, the nuclear threat, which is usually the one that the Russians go out and say, don't give them tanks or don't give them F-16 because we are going to use nuclear weapons or we have nuclear weapons. They stopped doing that because it proved to be not terribly useful, because they threaten quite clearly some form of nuclear escalation for every asset that we gave them. When we're talking about F-16s, they threaten. When we give them M1 tanks, they threaten them. Nobody took them seriously. And so there's like an inflation of that threat, an inflationary aspect of that, especially nuclear escalation threat, that has therefore led to a loss of value of that. So that's one. The second aspect I would say is that at this point is that, Russia has escalated the war without a response by us, and particularly Ukrainians, because they don't have the means, by striking population centers, which have no military value except for the political value of undermining societal strength and support for Zelensky and perhaps the war in Ukraine. But they have been striking those centers for months now with no comparable response. And comparable, I don't mean a Ukrainian strike of civilian populations in Russia. I mean comparable in the sense that Ukrainian strikes on military and logistical and perhaps even energy sectors in Russia. They've done it through the very few means they have, very uh, cheap, fairly primitive, but so far fairly effective drones. But again, the numbers of this, the sheer quantity is very limited in comparison to what the Russians have done. So the Russians have escalated with no response from us.
So there seems to be competing visions not only within the Republican Party about how best to bring this conflict to a resolution, but also within the White House itself. Some of the senior officials you see, occasionally giving very different messages. J.D. Vance has come out very strong against the U.S. involving itself in this conflict at all, and some other officials saying otherwise. What's your sense of the internal debate going on in the White House right now?
I have no, I'm not privy to any of those debates, so I don't know who is where on these issues, and the public, the stuff that you see on the public, I take it with a sort of grain of salt. I think ultimately, I think it depends on the president, which is true of this administration, but of any other administration. This is a presidential decision. And if the president decides that it's time to up the support for Ukraine, I think this will be done. Um, I think Trump still seems to, again, I have no other information except for the front pages of the news. Trump seems still has some hope that this can be negotiated right now. Um, I am not so sure because the negotiations will happen when both sides are exhausted. And right now, it doesn't seem that way, or at least not yet. Even the Ukrainians are not exhausted. They're not ready to negotiate away things that, for instance, they're not going to give territories that they're still occupied, they're still sitting on it. They may agree to a ceasefire along the military lines right now, but they're not going to give the territories as the Russians have asked of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which are not under Russian control. If the Russians wanted, they have to fight for them. So this may actually continue for a while, and it's going to be a war essentially of attrition, which is now. It's not going to be a massive breakthrough, in my view.
So what might be, a sign for us to look for that they are becoming exhausted? When might that happen?
I think, well, on the Ukrainian side, I think will depend a lot on the political aspect. If Zelensky really is pressured, for instance, to leave um, power and a new politician, perhaps a new general, comes in and decides that this is it, we have to really sit down and perhaps give territories away. That's sort of one side. It's possible, it's plausible. There are serious problems that Ukrainians have, including on the sort of demographic problems. The average age or sort of the Ukrainian soldiers in the 40s, which is pretty old. So there are limits on how much they do it. It seems to me right now those have not been yet reached, and the internal fights or debates within the Ukrainian elite, political elite, are kept, if there are any, and they're kept under wraps for good reasons. So they're not visible. On the Russian side, I think it will be mostly a decision of Putin. There isn't any serious opposition to him, as far as we know. There's no politician that is running against him. Good luck doing that. Um, there is no hope that there will be a military opposition to him. He controlled the military quite well. And I mean, the only opposition, which was still bizarre, was from um, the it's mercenaries that were fighting in Ukraine that attempted some sort of coup d'etat. Interesting enough that that coup d'etat wasn't just to stop the war. The coup d'etat, or the motivation behind it was that the war was not fought the way they wanted to fight, more viciously. So again, I think that they're not there. I think one of the things that is clear from one of the lessons of this war, a tragic lesson, is that war really depends on manpower. We thought of war as a technological game in many ways. It's there, absolutely. Technology matters, no question about it, but manpower is essential. And so, whichever side has manpower problems, serious manpower problems, will probably be the one that gives up. I don't know which one side will be. Obviously, from a demographic perspective, Russia has an advantage, but they're also limit how much they can recruit. They're recruiting a lot, but right now the latest numbers seem to be saying that they're recruiting replacement level numbers, namely that they lose 1,000 soldiers, they're able to recruit about 1,000, and we're talking about thousands per month, but that's roughly the number. Will they be able to do it for a long period of time? I don't know. Are the replacements as good as the ones they have lost? Probably not, because they have to train them faster. Some have to be forced, some have to be paid, et cetera, et cetera. The Ukrainians, as I mentioned, have a problem with age. Also, there's a massive demographic problem that started 30 years ago for Ukrainians. And so we'll see how that goes.
It's just an unbelievable tragedy all around. Um, Last question. What's your gut telling you? Is Trump going to be able to pull this off in the near future?
Well, I don't know what near future means. I think he might be able to do it within his tenure, within his 4 years. He has three left of the administration. He might, but I think a lot of it will depend on how much he is willing to escalate American support for it. And I don't know, but I think he might. I mean, I'm not, or I think Trump is the ultimate politician, which means that he has enormous capability of being flexible. He has no qualms about saying one thing one day, and the next day say, Putin is a jerk, or some worse word that he probably will use at some press conference, and he'll say, you know what, I won't talk to him anymore. I'm done. Yesterday he said something. I like these. We have these great conversations, and the conversations go well, but nothing happens out of them. So, the idea that a few months ago that he can meet with him and everything will be fine because personal interaction was so good, I think that's gone. We'll see what happens. So again, I think he's the ultimate politician of great flexibility, which means that at some point he can say, let's arm them more. And so far seems like, there's some signs that we're going in that direction. Um, Look, at the end of the day, this is a war. This is the biggest war on the European continent since 1945. And as such, this war will end when it's no longer military feasible for both sides to achieve the ends that they want to achieve. And they have to sit down at the table. Um, that, in many cases, is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that one side gives up, mainly Ukraine in this particular case, gives up completely and collapses. That would be a horrible tragedy. The best case scenario is that there's a military stalemate, and both sides realize that the military stalemate is in place, and therefore some negotiation is feasible. So I think, Trump seems to me uh, has thought that there was a military stalemate from our perspective. This is horrible, as you said. This is a horrible tragedy. Why the heck are you guys doing it? Let's sit down at a table. The two sides don't see it that way. And so we have to figure out whether it's within our tools, we have a basket of tools at our disposal to achieve that military stalemate. I think we do. The question is whether the president and the administration sees it that way and whether they're willing to use it.
Well, Jacob, I thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your contribution to the section last week. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.